of the church, but there are certain things that require us to address them, and that is when crisis and catastrophe hits our nation. And we are living in a time of crisis. If you were not watching the news this morning, Korea has detonated yet another bomb, one that is double the strength of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one that many scholars are calling a city buster, one that is very powerful and damaging, and we are on the brink of nuclear war. That is a crisis. If you are not familiar with the areas in which we live, young people have died, young people have lost their lives, young people are hurting and hospitalized. We are definitely in a time of crisis. Opioid addiction is at an all-time high. Divorce is at an all-time high. Suicide is at an all-time high. We are in crisis moments.
Come on, Red.
And just for some stats, Hurricane Harvey has done over $70 billion in property damage. 300,000 people are now without electricity. At least 33,000 are temporarily homeless. And 13,000 have been rescued. And as of yesterday, Saturday, September the 2nd, the death toll has reached 53 people. 53 lives taken by this storm. That calls for us to wonder, what does God have to say in all of this? Many people are hopeless, and many people are distraught and discouraged, and we want to know, what does God have to say? And it is in this text that we find what God has to say. This synoptic account is written by Dr. Luke. We know who Dr. Luke is. He's a Gentile physician and historian that was a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul.
That's right.
He was the one who wrote that Jesus cares for those who no one else cares about. Jesus is the friend of sinners who came to seek and save that which was lost.
Yes.
Jesus cares for women, children, poor, brokenhearted, those who are bereaved, those who are like us, those who are outcast, and those who are sick. This particular text is designed to teach us a few things in the contextual and pretextual perspective. What's going on here in the text is we're wondering and trying to figure out what Christians should do. That's what the problem in the text is. Jesus does a series of question and answer forums. And as he's teaching, the question is, as Christians, what do we do when catastrophe hits? Because many of us are in tune with worshiping, and many of us are in tune with praising, but we don't do anything when crisis hits our community. The church is silent when problems strike our nation. And so the question is placed, what do we do? And today I want to talk about an unusual trial. An unusual trial.
All right.
You'll understand it shortly. An unusual trial. For a subtopic, I want to deal with the subtopic, which one are you? Which one are you? For call and response purposes, very quickly, let's find a neighbor in close proximity to us. Look them in the face, look them in the eye, smile at them and say, neighbor, which one are you? That's a question that all of us should be able to answer by the end of this particular message. Which one are you? That is a question, not rhetorical question, a literal question that only you can answer for yourself.
Well,
You can't answer it for anybody else. You can't answer it for your fellow church members, for your spouses, even for your children.
come on.
You only can answer that question for you. And so in the contextual and pretextual perspective, Jesus has fed 5,000 in the wilderness. And we know that he fed them because when he saw them, they were like sheep without a shepherd. And the Bible teaches us in chapter number 9 that he felt compassion for them. Compassion, co-suffering. He was suffering with them. And so that word compassion translates in chapter 9 and in chapter 10. And as he goes on, he finds himself coming into contact with a young boy who is possessed with a demon, whose dad brought him to Jesus because the disciples and the church couldn't do anything with him.
Well.
And so after he healed the young boy, Jesus goes on, and in addition to the 12 disciples, Jesus has now gained a following. And now he is selecting people for work. And he selects 70 people out of the group and pairs them up and sends them out in twos after he tells them the harvest is plentiful. But that's a contrasting conjunction. Contrasting conjunction means that whatever is said, when you see but in the text, that means it's going in a different route. The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few.
Yeah.
And so he instructs them, he says, pray to the Lord of the harvest that he'll send out workers into the harvest. And they do it. But when they get done praying, he sends them. That's an ironic thing, because they just prayed to the Lord of the harvest to send workers into the harvest to work the field. But when they got done praying, Jesus sent them. I'll pause parenthetically just in case you didn't get it. He literally says that if there's something wrong in your community or in your state or in your country, when you pray that God will send them help, don't wait for everybody else to go.
That's right.
You go.
That's right.
Because waiting for everybody else, the people who need the help might never get it. So he says when you're praying to the Lord of the harvest, they were literally praying to the Lord, not realizing that they were standing in front of the Lord. And the Lord turned around and said, now you go. And he sends them, and they come back talking about what they had done. And so these 70 people, along with the 12 disciples and the other people that were following Jesus, they sat down and he started to teach them. But as he was teaching them, the disciples got into an argument.
Well.
The argument was, who is the greatest out of all of us? Who's the best disciple? Who's the most important disciple? And he says, the one who receives this child in my name. The one who receives those who are looked over. The ones who will open their doors when nobody else will. That's the greatest of these. And so it is upon this basis that Jesus starts to tackle crisis problems. But while he's teaching about what they should do, a lawyer stands up. In the crowd, there's a lawyer. And the lawyer says, teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus answers his question with a question. Don't we hate when people do that? If I ask you a question, I want you to answer me. I don't want you to ask me another question. But here, he asked Jesus a question, and Jesus turns around and asks him a question. He says, what does the law say? How does it read to you? And he says this in verse 26. You can read it in your spare time. And he goes on to quote the law that is stated in Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 5, and Leviticus 19 through 18, where it says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, all your mind. And then love your neighbor as you love yourself.
That's right.
That's what he says to Jesus. And watch what Jesus says. He says, you have answered the question correctly. Go and do it, and then you shall live. That's the same answer that Jesus has given the Christian church today. Because, Veronica, we have the answers in the Christian church. But the issue is information without application is worthless. I'll give it to you again. Information without application is worthless. What does that mean? It literally means you can know the right answer, But if you don't apply what you know, you're not doing anything at all. This lawyer knew the right answer, but he wasn't applying the knowledge he had gained. And so Jesus pointing his problem out, because Jesus had to tell him to do it, which means he was preaching and teaching, but wasn't practicing what he was preaching. Jesus pointing him out and say, do what you tell other people to do. He said, well, Jesus, who is my neighbor? Why would he say a question like that? Because Jews were beside themselves. They were an exclusive nation. And so, Kia, when Jews came into being, they decided everybody around them pushed him away. They didn't want to have anything to do with them. As a matter of fact, Jews could see a Gentile woman, a woman who was not a Jew, literally having pregnancy issues and wouldn't help. Because, as one Jew quoted, that would be helping bring another Gentile into the world. So they were vicious and mean and hateful towards one another. And so they never helped anybody. They were all to themselves. So in their study, what they really said was, our neighbor is our fellow Jew. But we all don't stay next to people who are just like us.
That's right.
We all don't come into contact and work with and go to school with people who are just like us.
That's right.
When we drive on the highways, there are many different types of people that pass us by. And Jesus says each and every one of them is your neighbor. And so he's correcting him, because now he's asked the question, who is my neighbor? And so Jesus gives him the Good Samaritan story. Now, I want to make a note here. People call this the parable of the Good Samaritan. The text says Jesus said, not Jesus told them a parable. Which means this was not a parable. This was a real story that happened. And so the story was, in the contextual verses, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers, and they stripped him, beat him, and left him laying there half dead. And by chance, a priest was going down that same road. And when he saw him, passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite came up to him, looked at him, and passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan who was on that journey down the same road, when he saw him, felt compassion and came up to him and bandaged his wounds, poured oil and wine on them, put him on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, took care of him. On the next day, took out 2 pence, 2 denarii, gave it to the innkeeper and said, take care of him. Whatever you spend, I'll repay when I return. And then he asked the question in our text. Now, which of these do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell among robbers? And again, he asked the question and answered it perfectly. He said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus says, go and do the same thing. An unusual trial. How's this unusual? Because the text said, Laura, that the lawyer stood up. In a teaching setting, the lawyer stood up and began to basically give Jesus a pop quiz. He literally said, teacher, how do I do it? Here was the problem in the text, Joyce. Everybody knew Jesus was a teacher.
Come on.
Everybody knew Jesus was a healer, or as Big Mama would say, a doctor in a sick room. But they had not accepted the fact that Jesus was not just a doctor in a sick room,
That's right.
but a lawyer in the courtroom.
Yeah.
That's why this was an unusual trial, because the law expert didn't realize that, as one unknown author quoted, teaching is the profession that teaches all other professions. Meaning that if before he became a lawyer, he had to go to law school. And at law school, he was taught by a teacher.
Well,
Which means he was asking another lawyer that was better than him how to do something, trying to trick him and trap him up. Jesus literally said, if you really know what you're doing, you shouldn't have to ask me a question at all. He asked Jesus. Jesus responds to him. He answers correctly, but his application is all messed up. And that's what's wrong with our Christian Church of America. We know what to do. We say we know what to do. If you go on the news and you listen to the reporters, they say, well, all they got to do is such and such. It's just as simple as doing this, this, and this. But if it was so simple, why you ain't done it?
Well,
church folk have a remedy for everybody's problem. Yet, if you already know the solution, why haven't you solved the problem?
come on.
The issue is our practice doesn't measure up to our preaching. And so Jesus says in an unusual trial, he says, instead of trying to talk to me and make yourself seem good, let me twist up your law against you, seeing as I wrote the law that you quote day and night.
Well,
He says, since you're quoting your law to me in a court setting, how about I take the lawyer's seat and you take the seat of the defendant?
that's right.
And let's turn this trial into an unusual trial where now the lawyer is the one having to defend himself.
Come on, come on.
And so we see three things in the text of verse 36 through 37. In the beginning of verse 36, we see Jesus' interrogation. He interrogates him. He asks a question in verse 36. He says, which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into robbers' hands? He interrogates a lawyer. He puts a question mark in you study in grammar and in English that anytime you see a question mark, that's an interrogative statement. He's asking a question, and so he uses three interrogative pronouns. He says, which of these?
Well,
Which of these? In relation to the story, he's using which of these three? The three people who those pronouns represent are the priest, the Levite, and the Samaritan.
that's right.
Now, if you know Jewish history, Jews were very priestly beings. Jericho was a priestly city. Jerusalem was the place where they went to work in the temple. And so it was no strange thing that there was a priest on the road from Jericho to Jerusalem.
Come on, Red.
He was supposed to be there because that was his daily travel to work every day. It's more like when I come, when I would go back and forth from Memphis, I would always go up 78, now I-22. It was just the usual thing that I would get up and go from one street to the next and then find my way on 22 going to Memphis. And when I got out of school, I would turn around and get right back on 22 and come right back down. And every day it was a routine thing, so much so that I could probably drive up 22 with my eyes closed and know exactly where I was. I would know by the mile marker exactly which county I was in because I had done it so much. It was second nature that I was never lost. And if something would ever happen, I would know exactly where I was. The priest was supposed to be on that road. Levites, as we all know, were servants that were given in the time of the book of Leviticus. They worshiped and they led praise and worship at the church. They led the sacraments. They led the Bible studies. They were teachers. They were servants. They were deacons. And yet, the Levites were supposed to be on that road.
That's right.
The bloody way is what they called this road. They called it the bloody way, Josh, because in 20 miles, they went down 250 feet. From here to there in 20 miles. Sea level and elevation dropped drastically. They dropped down. The road was rough. It was narrow, Mike. They had stones and rocks there that robbers and bandits hid behind.
Wow.
And whenever somebody came along, straggling by themselves, the robbers pounced on them, beat them, took what they had, and left them laying there. And in the case that nobody came along, the robbers would play a trick on them and set a trap. Take one of the robbers and make him look beat up. Lay him in the middle of the street and wait for somebody to come along and try to help. And when they came along, the robber would turn over, grab them, and they would all pounce in on the person, beat them, rob them, and leave them laying in the street. But yet priests traveled this road every day. Church people, Levites, traveled this road every day.
Yeah.
And there was a regular old man coming down the road and fell into the trap. The text says they beat him within inches of his life.
My God.
They stole everything from him and left him laying there half dead. The priest came by, that's the pastor, he came by and he remembered as he was looking at him that he had traveled up this road before and that robbers might be on their way to get him. And he remembered the law of Leviticus that says if you touch a dead body, you are ceremonially unclean. And so he didn't want to stoop down to that level and present himself at a risk. So he left him there.
Paint your picture, Red.
Levi, the servant, Levi, book of Leviticus, where they get the second part of this law, which says, love your neighbor as yourself. He comes along, reciting the law as they did day and night. They recited, love your neighbor as yourself. Love them just like you love you. And he saw the man, got close to him, looked at him, and turned away and walked off. And a despised Samaritan, who Jews hated.
Come on, come on.
They didn't like him. It wasn't a dislike, Q. It was a hatred because they were mixed breed Jews. They had impure blood. They had impure skin. Their skin tone wasn't the same. Their vocalists wasn't the same. Their temple worship process wasn't the same. They were just different. So they hated him.
Well,
the Samaritan comes along, and one would think, well, if the preacher was bad and the Levite was bad, surely this Samaritan is just the worst one of all.
Well.
But he doesn't do what's expected because the preacher was on the road. The Levite was on the road. But the text says the Samaritan was on a journey, which means he had been down this way 1,000 times. And he felt compassion on him. He suffered with him. Maybe because he realized that on this journey he had been there a long time.
Well.
Maybe he had been there once, Clay, where the robbers had pounced on him. Maybe he recognized and could relate to what that man was going through. Maybe he was just someone who had a compassionate heart, who said, if it was me in their shoes, I want somebody to help me. We don't know which story actually fit him. But what we do know is on the road there was an inn.
That's right.
And at that inn there were rooms open. And the Samaritan, though he wasn't liked, had enough respect from the innkeeper. And after he took the man, applied first century first aid to the man, bandaged him up, poured oil and wine, what was their mixture of alcohol, made sure the wounds were clean so he wouldn't get infected on the ride, put him on a donkey, let him ride his own donkey while he walked, took him, got him a room, paid for it, and said, take care of him until I get back. And the innkeeper said, okay. And yet, that was the question. Which one do you think proved to be a neighbor? That's the problem with the church. That's the interrogation Jesus gives. He says, you can't just say you're a neighbor.
Well.
You have to prove you're a neighbor.
That's right.
In other words, we would say it like this: your actions speak louder than your words.
That's right.
He literally says, don't just say you love them, prove it. Because if you really love somebody, they can tell, and everyone else can too. He says, so prove it so that you actually look like what you came to believe.
Come on.
Because the Jews were God's people, God's chosen generation, God's chosen nation way back with Abraham when he said, your people will be my people and I will take care of them. These were God's elect, chosen people, the holiest of holy. And yet, they didn't look like God. Because as we studied today in Sunday school, God made a promise that he would show grace and mercy to everybody for all the generations to come. Yet God's people aren't gracious and aren't merciful. That's the problem, and that's the interrogation that Jesus gives. So the question is, how is this man going to answer this question?
Well,
because he says, who do you think? That's the issue. We don't think about these type of things. We like to worship, like to praise, and can recite all the books of the Bible, yet have not applied the simplest rule. Because to love your neighbor as yourself doesn't just mean to care about them.
come on.
But it means the same way you treat yourself, the same way you ought to treat somebody else.
That's right.
In other words, Josh, I'll sit there, and even though I got money to do other stuff, I'll buy a ticket to an Alabama ball game because I think I deserve it. I like myself that much, and I love Alabama football that much. I'll buy tickets because I just deserve it in my mind. He says, the same way you think you deserve certain stuff, those people you see every day deserve just as much.
That's right.
He says, the same way you quote that God is a God of mercy and a God of grace, and he's shown mercy to you and shown grace to you, is the same way you have to show grace and mercy to other people. He then says, love your neighbor as you love yourself after you love God with all your strength, all your heart, all your soul and mind. He literally implies this. If you don't love your neighbor, it shows you really don't love God.
Wow.
If you cannot love your neighbor, you cannot love God. What do you mean? He literally says, how can you love your brother, or how can you hate your brother who you see daily, but claim that you love God whom you never see?
That's right.
If you don't have love for people, you can't have love for God, because God loves people. How do you know God loves people? John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave. If you can't give to people, he says you don't really love God.
That's right.
You can't be a Christian, because Christian signifies that I'm a follower of Christ, and Christ is the Son of God who literally gave up his own life to save you.
Come on.
All he's asking you to do is give up what little bit you have or what excess you have to help somebody in need, and we can't do that. We watch from afar. And he says if you're watching and not doing anything, you're not being a Christian. So he's interrogating him, and he's waiting on him to answer the question. So after we see Jesus' interrogation in the first part of verse 37, he answers the lawyer's declaration. We see Jesus' interrogation, and next we see the lawyer's declaration. He says, and he said, the one who showed mercy towards him.
That's right.
He answered correctly. He knew the Bible. He knew God's law. He just had a problem with the practicality of it.
That's right.
He knew how to do it, and he knew what to do. He just didn't do it. But that made him look guilty.
That's right.
Because Bernice, my big mama didn't have much of an education. She only made it to the 6th grade. But she would say something like this: when you know better, you do better.
That's right.
She didn't have much and really didn't know that much. She wasn't that smart, but that simple phrase, when you know better, you do better, made a difference. Because the more people knew, the more they did.
That's right.
the more you experience from God, the more you're supposed to do to others. As a matter of fact, that's what Paul says when he gives in Romans chapter 12, verse 1. He says, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God. Watch, which is your reasonable service.
That's right.
He literally says, the more mercy God has poured on you, the more serving you ought to do for him. So everybody take 5 seconds and think about as much mercy as you've received over your life. And as much mercy as you can think about, that's how much service you ought to be doing.
Wow.
And if your service doesn't match your mercy, then you're not being a Christian.
Wow.
You're no better than a scribe, a Pharisee, a hypocrite. So he says, what say you? He answers the question correctly. But then, after we see Jesus' interrogation and the lawyer's declaration, we see Jesus' imperative. An imperative statement is a command.
That's right.
A declaration states something, but an imperative statement, an imperative is a command.
That's right.
What is he supposed to do? Look what Jesus says. Jesus said to him, go and do the same. That's God's message to the Christian nation today. You know what to do. Now go do it. You got the information. Now follow with the application. He says, he gives a twofold imperative. Go and do. Now watch what this means. He literally says, you can't do it if you don't go. You can't help him if you don't go to them.
That's right.
Which tears up the church's preconceived notion that if you build it, they'll come. No, they're not. If you offer it, they'll come get it. No, they won't.
That's right.
The Christian church is based off of Christ. When you look at Jesus, he was a traveling person.
That's right.
He walked everywhere. Everywhere he met somebody was on the side of the road somewhere. Everybody he went to see them. As a matter of fact, Jesus would travel long distances for just one person.
That's right.
How do you know? Remember when Jesus healed the woman with an issue of blood
My God.
in the midst of the crowd? He healed her. But after he healed her, he said, come on, y'all. Let's get in the boat and go to the other side. They were going to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, crossing an entire ocean. What was on the other side? One man with a legion of demons inside of him. Jesus sailed from a crowd of over 5,000 across the lake for one man with 5,000 problems. I'll give it to you again, you didn't catch it. Jesus left 5,000 people and sailed across an ocean to get to one man with 5,000 problems. And after he fixed the 5,000 problems, watch what he said to the disciples. Now let's go back to the other side. Jesus traveled long distances for one person. And we won't travel for the many people we see in our community who are hurting. 30,000 people homeless. We ain't going over there.
Well,
somebody else can do that. That's dangerous. Jesus traveled. As a matter of fact, the disciples had to sail through a storm to fix somebody who was going in a storm. Jesus traveled for one person. As a matter of fact, he traveled so far that he says, who do you think showed him mercy? And he said, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus says, go and do the same. Which means there will be people who fall into robbers' hands. There will be people, Laura, who feel like life has beat them up, robbed them of something, and they feel half dead.
come on.
They feel left by themselves to die.
Yeah.
There are people who will come into contact with who feel like whatever they've been through in life has beat them so bad
My God.
that they're bloody, they're barely making it, and they're just laying there waiting to die.
Yeah.
He says, go do this, and then you'll live. So we ask, well, where was the example? What was Jesus in all this? Jesus just told the story, but that's not gospel. As a matter of fact, it is. Even though this was a Samaritan man, in John chapter 8, I believe it was verse 48, the Jews called Jesus a Samaritan.
That's right.
Not because of his blood and his lineage, but because of his actions. The Samaritan was traveling. Jesus traveled. The Samaritan was stopped on the road in dangerous territory. Jesus was stopped in dangerous territory.
That's right.
The Samaritan would help any old body that went through anything because they didn't have much. Jesus said, foxes have holes and birds have nests, but the Son of Man have nowhere to lay his head.
That's right.
Jesus was Samaritan by nature. But not only that, but Jesus traveled far for one person. And the lake wasn't the farthest thing that he traveled from. As a matter of fact, Jesus traveled from heaven to earth.
That's right.
As a matter of fact, Jesus traveled so far only to come down and not have a place to live. Why would he do it? For you.
That's right.
And for me. He would travel so far for one person who was living in sin, disconnected from God. Jesus was that Samaritan on the road. Because the priest and Levite represented the law of Moses. And Paul says in Romans chapter 8, what the law could not do, God did.
My Lord.
Remember, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers few. And so, pray to the Lord of the harvest that he'll send workers into the harvest. Yes. But Jesus was the ultimate example, so when he had sent them after they prayed, he was only trying to instruct them that if they just look up, they would see where when we said our prayers in Psalms, will thou not revive us again? That God answered and sent himself. When God wanted a message to be done, he sent man. But when God wanted a miracle to happen,
yes, sir,
he came himself. Okay, you don't believe me? Watch this. When God wanted Pharaoh to hear a message, he sent Moses.
Come on, Rev.
But when God wanted to make dry land out of a wet sea, he came himself.
My Lord.
When he wanted Nebuchadnezzar to understand that they weren't going to bow, he sent 3 Hebrew boys. But when they got to the furnace,
yes, sir,
and needed help, he sent himself.
That's right.
You ain't caught it yet. I give it to you again. When he wanted King Darius to know that his law wasn't higher than God's law, he sent Daniel. But when Daniel was in the lion's den and needed help, he came himself.
My Lord.
And when you and I were lost in sin, just like this man who went down life's road, the bloody life road, and found ourselves beat up by life because you know Satan comes to kill. You know, we found ourselves robbed of joy, robbed of peace, robbed of mercy, robbed of grace, robbed of God's presence because you know he came to steal. And felt like we're half dead because though we're alive in this body, we're dead in our trespasses, buried in our sins, headed to a devil's hell. We were left half dead. Jesus decided, I'll be that Samaritan.
Yes, sir.
And he came himself.
Oh, Rev.
And when he came himself, he said, I'll be that one to get off of my ride, my cloud, and put you on it. As a matter of fact, the Samaritan in the text used a donkey to transport the miracle. Every other king in the Bible rode horses, but there was one king that rode a donkey.
That's right.
If you read the Bible, Jesus went into Jerusalem riding on a donkey.
That's right.
The Samaritan man went and took him to bandage his wounds, poured oil on his wounds, and poured wine on his wounds.
Well,
As Jesus was sitting there in the Lord's Supper, there in the upper room, he poured wine
my God.
in the cup.
Yeah.
When you needed bandage over your sinful life because you needed healing because your wounds were too big, I believe Isaiah said, by his stripes,
We are. My
40 lashes saved one. Jesus was the Band-Aid we needed. And then when it came to making and preparing a place,
Come on, Rev.
when he said, take care of it,
My Lord.
Jesus said, okay, I'll take care of it. Took a cross with my name on it.
Yes, sir.
Took a cross with your name on it.
My God.
I think I go now. Took a cross with your name on it.
Yes, sir.
And marched it up Calvary Hill. And when we needed a Savior, God didn't send somebody else. But he sent somebody who wouldn't let us lay there half dead. As a matter of fact, sent somebody who wouldn't even let himself lay there half dead. Because Jesus said, my life is my own and I'll lay it down and I'll pick it back up. When we needed a room in the inn, Jesus, who had no room at the inn, made our reservation for us. Because he went to the receptionist desk at Calvary and put his name in blood. Signed it with his hands. Signed it with his feet. Signed it with his head in thorns. But then he took our place laying on the bloody road. How do you know it? Because the Bible says that Jesus didn't just put us on his donkey. Jesus didn't just walk past us, but Jesus died for me on that hill called Calvary. From the 6th to the 9th hour, he died there. Till the sun revealed the shine. I'm getting happy. He died there till the moon dripped out and blood. Oh, praise his name. Y'all know he died, don't you? He died to the centurion soldier. Y'all know what they said, don't you? Surely this must be the Son of God. And Jesus decided that he would make our reservation at the hotel that we needed. Because the inn in Bethlehem didn't have no rooms left. The inn on the bloody road didn't have no rooms left. But when we needed somebody to drop us off, Jesus decided to come get us. And we'll make our reservation at Heaven's Mansion Hotel in Heaven's Way. And when he came, he made a way for us. Because when he died, he came down that journey. And they laid him in a borrowed tomb. Friday night, he laid in the tomb. Saturday night he came, he laid in the tomb. But y'all know what happened, don't you? Sunday morning, he got up with all the power. And when he got up, our reservation had been made. But I got good news. With the Samaritan, dropped the man off at the hotel. With the Samaritan, told him he was leaving. With the Samaritan, came from the room. I got good news for you. The Samaritan man told the innkeeper, I'll be back one day. And I got good news for you. Jesus, 40 years have passed by. 1,000 years have passed by. 2,000 years have passed by. But I got good news for you. He's coming back one day. Anybody know he's coming back? He's coming back there because he needs to take us through. He's coming back there because he paid my debt. And I'm so glad today when I leave y'all here. God bless your heart. But I need to give his glory because he knows when you were left all by yourself. He thought of you when you were left there. Why would I sin? He thought of you when you were left there. Broken by life storms. He thought of you because he paid for your room. How did he pay it? Y'all know what the devil said, don't you? I am redeemed, born with the price. Jesus has changed my life. If anybody asks you just who I am, tell me. And y'all will praise him with me. Let me redeem all of the Lord. Say so. If he said it, so. But if you know about the grace and mercy, wave your hand and try to thank you. Thank you, Lord. You've been good to me. Even after the hurricane, the smoke after harvest, I never know it because it was good for me. It's good for you. Anybody know it? Know that he'll do it. If you know he do it, tell him your neighbor. Neighbor, don't worry. God will take care of you. Be not dismayed. Whatever the time, God will take care of you. Take care of you. Anybody come to do it? I said, anybody come to do it? Lord, you do it. Lord, you do it. Shake